Good evening, thanks for being here. Please grab a sketchbook and some pencils. We're looking for a variety of pencils. H's, B's. Doesn't have to be anything ultra specific, just a variety of pencils, please. Thank you. I like to begin with a quote. I've got my Deane Keller book right here, which is the Draftsman's Handbook. An awfully difficult book to find. It's out of print, and I got to tell you, this is one of the most precious things that I have. The reason why it's so precious for me is because my copy was autographed to me by Deane Keller, who wrote, "To Dan with admiration." And it's always been a priceless thing for me to have that. And I've loved Deane forever and ever. So I go to Deane often because he was so wise. In a moment like this, where we're looking for inspiration, because we want to set a precedent, like a kind of mental precedent for the task at hand, which is to lift our game to the next level, and to see better, and to perform better, and to understand more as we build our work. So let's see if we can find a Deane quote which will bring us to that state of mind. How about this one? On page 150, he says, "Bring more than the materials to the work of the studio. Bring ideas, expectations, resolve, and bring your strengths and weaknesses." So I think that's part of what encapsulates his brilliance so much. He says ideas, which is more than a kind of technical exercise. He always had the larger plan in mind for where you would take your technical expertise. So when he says ideas, what I think he's saying is essentially what you want to say with your work after you establish proficiency or gain proficiency in your work. So that's what I think he means by ideas. I love expectations because you're setting goals for yourself as you draw. You're trying to aspire to something of a higher order of thought and performance, and that won't come out of indifference. It has to come from expectations. Resolve, I think, is also a wonderful word that he utilizes. Resolve goes to the fact that what you're doing in drawing and in studying in the visual arts takes real courage to do, and resolve is something that accompanies courage because you're dedicated to it. And resolve is a kind of strength-based dedication, as I see it, if that makes any sense. And then bring your strengths and weaknesses. Bring your honest self to the forum so that when you're drawing, you don't expect yourself to be perfect at everything. And this is something that needs to be said in this situation and in many, that when you're coming to the forum of drawing and drawing the figure, if you expect every mark to be a kind of accomplished mark, then that just isn't realistic. You're going to make things happen there that are underwhelming and things that are, they're like epiphanies that occur in the course of the session with the model. Anyway, I'm going to go with that. Bring more than the materials of the work to the studio. Bring ideas, expectations, resolve, and bring your strengths and weaknesses. So on that note, let me put my Deane Keller down and I'll come right back. So what I'm going to do is sit down here and block the camera for a second with my head. Forgive me for a minute. But what I've decided to get into with you tonight, and I think for the next few times that we speak about drawing, I want to shift gears in my dialogue with you and cover something that I would refer to hereafter as tonal quality. The tonal quality of your drawings. It's a sense of really utilizing the values or tones, and you must keep in mind that when I say tone and value, I'm going to use those words interchangeably. What I essentially mean is a degree of dark or light that you would use in a drawing, a shade, a tone, or a value. And I try to use them interchangeably because I hate the idea of being monotonous and of not using the language to, hopefully, its utmost ability. I like the language because the language allows us to draw upon certain metaphors and opportunities to visualize and to use visionary language to try to strengthen what we're seeing in our technical approach. But I saw, honestly, some things that I thought could be addressed in a discussion about tonal quality. So what I want you to do with me is break out your sketchbook, please. And I want you to grab, while you have your sketchbook with me, a piece of paper. I've got a random scrap piece of paper here. Now my paper is a Strathmore 400 series piece of drawing paper. I've torn it down to a small size because I don't need it to be a perfect specimen of paper, because I'm going to make some shades on it, and I hope you will as well. But I want you to notice that in the paper that I've laid out on this easel, you probably won't be able to see it that easily. However, it does have some texture. And the texture of the paper is going to be a factor in why you use what you use, what you select, why you select it, all that good stuff. And increasingly you want to be aware of the kind of texture that you like, that you respond to, and nobody really knows what that's going to be except for you. And it just so happens that over the decades of teaching, graphite has become the mainstay. Graphite pencil has become the go-to material for a lot of the ideas that we exchange and a lot of the collaboration that goes on. Whether somebody's a beginner or advanced, we tend to work really well under the exchange of graphite. In terms of the paper that I've gone to again and again is Strathmore 400 because it's so ubiquitous. It's available everywhere, and the paper is the brown cover. It's the one with the lady's face, and she has the earring and has the Strathmore logo on it. I don't think that's necessarily the ideal paper, and I'm willing to make a change, and I might be shifting my paper as I go forward. However, that's what I'm using. I'm going to talk about the pencils for a second. I'm going to use tonight some Tombow pencils. These are Mono 100s. This is going to be a 2H, and I've also got a 4B, a 2H and a 4B. In addition, I'm going to use a kneaded eraser, and I'm going to use a blending stump, which is a piece of paper rolled up. Let me see if I can find one. Just looks like that, a blending stump. Alright, so what I want you to do, please, is take your harder lead. I don't care if it's a 4H or if it's a 2H like mine, or if it's a 3H, and I just want you to make a tone with that on the paper, please. Go ahead and do it with me. If you see this tonality that I'm making on the page, and hopefully you can, I'm doing what I call double stroking, going up and down. When you grain the paper, this is kind of what you do. You just run the pencil or the chalk across the page, and this generally tends to highlight the texture of the paper. And this is the way some people draw, and it's totally cool. It's totally fine. If you want to see examples of awesome graining or graining technique, look at Seurat, Georges Seurat. He did some incredible graining techniques in his use of Conte on Michelet. So if you have a more exotic, let's say, paper fiber, you will see it come through. You'll see like the lines that sit underneath of the kind of superficial fibers once you grain. And so you can see when I do this with the 2H pencil, I accomplish a kind of tonality, don't I? I get this tone where we don't really actually arrive at very much hatch. It's a pretty solid tone. So you want to be aware of that because sometimes you do want to hatch and sometimes you don't want to hatch. And my own attitude about hatch mark is it needs to go hand in hand with flat tonality. In fact, flat tonality, flat tones, or the construction of value patterns is going to be one of your essential skills, and that's why tonight's very important. I hope that you don't mind if I go to ultra fundamental stuff tonight, but I do think it's important. So now what I want you to do, please, is grab the soft pencil. Mine is a 4B, and I'm going to make a tone. I want you to make the same tone, the same value, the same exact degree of dark and light with a really soft pencil. This is going to take some doing in your wrist, isn't it, in your shoulder, because you don't want to push down that hard. You're going to feel, hopefully you feel like I do, it's like just tapping the accelerator on a sports car or something like, I don't know what to say. You know, you got a lot of muscle there, and if you want to use it, you can use it. If you don't, you don't have to, but it will get you what we could probably faithfully describe as the same or quite similar value. And it doesn't take much time, does it? So we put these two things down. Just about there, right? So now these are the two examples. This one right now, if you can see that, is going to be a 2H. And then this one is going to be a 4B. You've done the same thing, presumably. What do you notice about these two values? Even though they're the same, what's different about them? The nature of graining technique probably Again, we're looking at Seurat. We're looking at the way that he used the atmospheric quality in the paper to create those marvelous dramatic scenes of figures with backgrounds and such. That is probably more of a technique for a softer lead, we could say, right? We also notice that the paper fiber creates a different look to the texture, don't we? We could talk about these two values maybe in different ways. One of the things that I've described, this is kind of like goes with my thinking as I draw, is I feel like this value here has a bit of noise in it, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense to you? Well, if I say noise? It's a little bit less uniform because of the paper, and I'm going to try to describe why I think that is. Let's imagine that we could take this piece of paper and blow it up like it's in a microscope and look at it from the side, okay? And the paper would have a texture to it as per its nature, because this is a piece of paper made by Strathmore. It's a medium surface paper. It's what we call in the business semi-tooth. Semi-tooth. It's all really important stuff. Semi-tooth is a category, a bona fide category of paper, and so there are various things in semi-tooth that you have seen or heard of before. For example, Ang is semi-tooth paper. Laid is semi-tooth paper. Bristol is semi-tooth paper. It's not smooth, generally speaking, unless you get plate Bristol, but it is in between rough and smooth. And it turns out that what makes that is a piece of felt that they roll into the pulp of the paper. The felt makes the texture. And so the felt is going to create an upper surface. All right, if you grant me this, I'm imagining that my piece of paper is an enormous magnified version, and so I'm getting graphite all along the edges or crests of the paper fiber, and I'm getting nothing in the troughs of the paper fiber. Make sense? Good. So that is what I think we are seeing here, and that is what accounts for what I call the noise in the value. And what I contend is as you learn your value and how to create your values, you've got to become accustomed to the layering of the B's and the H's and what that will mean for heightening your characteristics of tone, your tonal quality in the work that you do. While we're on that topic, if it is unfamiliar to you what is meant by H and by B, I can go into that for about 15 seconds and tell you pretty easily. What you would want to imagine is a scale, everybody. And on one side of the scale, let's just call it 6B. And on the other side of the scale, we would call it 6H. All right, in the middle, between the 6H and the 6B, for all intents and purposes, we're going to put F, like a balancing scale. So the strange thing about the H and the B is it was picked up by the German pencil manufacturers a long time ago, and I'm talking like 100 and some years ago. And it was picked up in a kind of English phrase type of thing. H was meant to be hard, B was meant to be black. And so when they developed these original pencils, the more B's you would accumulate, the softer or blacker the graphite would become. That is, the less adulterated with clay the graphite was. So less clay, darker graphite, softer graphite. Now we have things like 14B, which is incredible, right? And then as you go toward the F, your meter goes toward the middle. The F is a beautiful pencil for structural drawing. I use it all the time. I use the 6B a lot in my sketchbook. I use the F a ton in my structural drawing. To the H, to the 2H, that's 2H, and others as I move toward the hard range. So what we're becoming familiar with is this kind of scale, this range of activity. And I think it's within this that all that magic of texture occurs in your work. And if you want to know what I mean by texture, I would invite you to take a look at some of the drawings by Adolf Menzel, who I believe is a master of texture in graphite. Just take a look at those mise-en-page drawings that he did, the beauty of the layout drawings, the sketches, and delight in the fur, savor the skin and the hair and the way that he worked the lines. I just feel like there is an instinct second to none at work in those drawings, in kind of tradition of understanding the material characteristics of what's being orchestrated. All right, wonderful. So then what we're going to do next, everybody, in your sketchbook, is let's take the 2H pencil, okay, the one that made this tone, and let's put that now on top of the 4B. All right, and as we do that, we're going to start to see something happen here. The tone is obviously going to get darker, but it isn't simply a matter of the tone getting darker, is it? When you see this occur before your eyes, in a sense you're beginning to kind of layer or embed the graphite. You can even hear it in my treatment if I would just shut up, right? The graphite goes into the paper a little bit more as it's burnished by the harder lead. So the harder lead goes in. We watch this entire passage fill in more, and this is a very hard lead on top of a very soft passage of graphite. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and what I'm doing is really looking into the way that the pencil behaves as I put one extreme on top of another. I think it is going into those low parts of the fiber, but there's something else. If you notice my hand, I'm in the writing stance right now. I'm not really in the drawing stance, which is something I think we've talked about over the course of the last couple years in class. This is the drawing stance, this is the writing stance, and when I do the writing stance, my leverage on the pencil changes, and that's a big part of tonight's conversation, is shifting the leverage on the lead. And again, it kind of goes back to the way that you want to wield the implement. I mean that in the most respectful way possible, because you've got a sense of how you want to draw. If, for example, you're the kind of artist that wants to work in a sketchbook in a somewhat modest format, you're probably well situated to draw in the writing stance. If on the opposite side, you're more of that artist that wants to learn in the forum of the life room with a group of colleagues working on 18 by 24, this is going to be almost out of step with that format, and you'd want to draw with the drawing or the kind of academic stance. This is literally something that Deane taught us, and it was very important to him, so much so that he took a cast of his father's hand. It meant a lot to hear that it was very important to learn this kind of stance because you'd be using your shoulder to orchestrate the material. All cool things, but before I forget, I'm saying that there are different ways of pushing the material into the paper. You can push it by the point, you can push it by a somewhat modified edge of the pencil. The pencil may or may not be super sharp when you do this. It doesn't have to be super sharp. If it's less sharp, it'll give you more of a kind of crayon coverage. If it's more sharp, it'll dig into the paper fiber more. I think we're going to look at that in a few minutes because my lead, this is something you can't see, unfortunately, on the video, but the lead that I'm using right now, I would describe it as very slightly rounded. You know, if my lead was enlarged, if this is my lead on my lead pencil, I'm using the edges of the pencil as they would seem naturally to want to be utilized to get the effect I'm after. You're trying to accomplish the flatness of value in accordance with your interests. You want that value to flatten out, you want the value to be uniform, because if you can't make a uniform value, it's going to be very difficult to create a form in any situation that effectively turns. Turning form is one of those mainstays of learning how to draw. So I go in, I look at this thing, and I kind of realize I've darkened it, but I also have changed its texture because I didn't darken it by pressing down on a 4B. I darkened it by actually going in there with a 2H on top of it, which is interesting. Now, what I want you to try in your sketchbook, do the opposite on the left side. Now I want you to take the soft lead pencil and drive that into the harder base, let's call it. The harder base. And as you do that, I think that you will be able to tell, as I can tell right now, that the handling is different. So now the soft piece is on top of the hard one, and it's like the pencil glides differently. It glides more smoothly across And you can see that the base of tonality, even though you're darkening it down, doesn't quite darken the same as the one on the right. You're able to go darker with the same exact materials, but the difference here between the two, almost like a scientific experiment, is the sequence. This will really go to your affinity for drawing, because you'll be the kind of artist that says, I really like starting with, a soft lead because it gives me a feel for what I want later. Or you might say, I really love starting with a hard lead because I build up this or that and it sets the parameters that I want it to set before I move on. What I really want to do in my practice is get a lead that responds to the goal I have in mind. The goal I have in the outset, or at the outset of a drawing, is to seize the moment with a vitality, a gestural vitality. And these days, for me, that's a B pencil. Once I have the B in play, then I'm after a simplified value. And I might, at that moment, go to a harder lead just to set that up. Because I don't know how you feel about yours, but I kind of like the idea of the one on the left myself, because there's something about setting things up where the harder leads feel like you're not so much drawing graphite on paper, you're drawing graphite on graphite, if that makes sense. Yeah, I would tie it to the interest that you have. There is a different character to things. This is one example of what could be carried to almost an extreme. Let's say if you got two really hard leads in, one was sharpened to that point, and a second hard lead was sharpened to a point like this. And you could use this one to go into the crevices of the paper, and this one to go across the tops of the paper. You could really set up a kind of almost painterly passage where the softer lead wouldn't even touch the paper, it would just go onto the graphite. That is interesting too. For me, mentally, when I go vertical, that's de-emphasizing the hatch and instead emphasizing the tonality, at least in a diagrammatic format. When we draw tonight, I'll be doing some diagonal hatch and I'll be de-emphasizing the hatch because I'll be trying to make a solid tone, a tone which doesn't really appear to show many lines within. If we're on the same page, let's keep going. This one is a 2H, and we put on top of it a 4B. I hope you find this interesting. This is a 4B, we put on top of it a 2H. Let's now go on top of the 4B layer on this side with another layer of 2H, and let's just see if that does anything. And I think you'll find that it does indeed. So what am I doing? I'm taking that harder lead, the one that I originally used, and I'm going on top of the softer lead, and it's giving me a different look to things. Again, I've got that idea of burnishing a passage. I think there's something kind of beautifully simple about this, and it reminds me, frankly, of oil paint. When I paint in oil, I will often be struck with the simple idea of speed. And oil, for me, if I add literally linseed oil to my paint goes faster. And if, on the other hand, I kind of dab the brush on a paper towel, my paint slows down. That's how I see it. To me, it's just beautifully simple that way. And I feel somewhat like this is akin to that, that the way that the material goes down, this H, kind of slows me down a little bit, gets me into the crevices of the page, that sort of thing. It is so fundamentally important to be able to control this stuff. You have to be able to create an exact value, but on your terms. Let's say you're drawing a skull. You'd want the value to both be precise, but also demonstrate the textural characteristics of the bone. And likewise, if you were doing a piece of drapery that's in cotton or something like that, you'd want to show that that also has the attributes of the texture as well as the value. Then I'm going to stump that value very, very lightly, although if I wanted to press down, I don't have to worry too much. And I want to get into that with you too. when you use one of these pieces of paper, all it really is paper on paper. And because of that, you don't have to worry so much about your pressure. You do have to be mindful of your pressure with this, because the one thing that you can't afford to do is to wreck the paper. If you go in and score the paper, that is, cut the paper with too much pressure, then it's kind of like game over. The entire piece is quite literally compromised, and you have to be just sensitive to that. The paper won't let you do it, but with a stump you can do it. So now that I go in and I create this, now I've burnished, in this case, the 4B with the 2H, and on top of that, I pressed the 2H into the mixture with a piece of paper. And that's given me a unified, or generally unified, tonality that I can then build on top of. It's not perfect, but it is something that you'd want to be aware of. It's a fairly complex system. All right, let's do one more on this side. We did 4B, 2H. Let's go back to the 4B and just finish this up doing it the opposite. That is, I'm working now with a soft pencil again. Hopefully you're trying this too. Hopefully you're getting something out of this conversation, because we generally don't talk about this too much, but I find it helpful. What we could try on this side, because we're talking about fundamental handling, questions about that, which are always good questions to ask, we could actually pick up on this idea of an ultra sharp pencil, because there are various ateliers, let's say, that practice this to either a lesser or a greater extent, usually a greater extent. And those ateliers don't so much subscribe to the idea of using one of these. People see this tool as the antithesis of best practices. I feel quite the opposite. This is an awesome tool. I don't care what anybody says. I love the stump. I taught my students how to smuggle these into ateliers. And the secret, and I even did this one year, which is ridiculous, but I think it was a COVID year, so we tried it. We cut one of the tips off of it, and we painted it like a cigarette. And then they put it behind their ear or in their pocket. And then when the teacher wasn't around, they just slipped the stump out of their pocket and they used it. So anyway, I'm using now a really sharp pencil, and this is how the atelier system does it. I pick up on my leverage, do you see that? And I go into the crevices with the point. I've never been a huge fan of this kind of drawing. To me it feels a little bit maniacal and tedious, and I like wielding the material in a free-flowing manner. So that's why I prefer to use the stump, but this is a technique. And I saw a lot of this kind of work being done where people were getting extremely fastidious about the tonal, let's say tonal exactitude or tonal exactness for what they were dealing with. And that certainly would involve using the tip of the pencil, in this case it's an F that I'm using, and going into the crevices and just getting at those parts down here that we talked about, you know, the pieces that are deep within the fiber. Whether you do this or not, it's really up to you, but if you're copying Barg, the effect is there, isn't it? You notice on some of the plates, or maybe most of the Barg plates, it isn't like the earlier academic, the Julian plates, the ones that came approximately 100 years before. Those plates were done with a far more hatchmark-centric manner. But the Barg plates come in the late 19th century, and they are undeniably more tonal and clear about the way they're using the value in the tone than the earlier plates were. I would presume that that was intentional. I would assume from the accounts that I've read about how disappointed the officials were with academic practice, that they were trying to get their students, generally speaking, back on track, so to speak, in a way that they understood tonal quality and tonal characteristics. And that's why they chose solid tones as opposed to hatch marks. The benefit of using the hatch mark is a graphic system, like looking at older drawings, looking at master drawings, and saying, you know, I understand the flair of the mark. I understand the penmanship of the mark. And the benefit of the solid tone would be I understand the complex of tonality, the way that you're building. Some people say the tonal structure, tonal development, Think of your favorite black and white movie. If you freeze frame a shot, like an anchor shot or something like that, a shot of something, we use Citizen Kane a lot in my class, so one of those shots of Citizen Kane has definitive areas of value that you can see, light to dark. And that's the kind of expertise I think they were trying to, at least in principle, instill in the late 19th century. From the accounts that are quoted in the Bark book, there was a meeting of the minds about how disappointed they were in student work. So what you should see in the Bark plates is not only an example of the way that they were talking about drawing and simplifying drawing, you should also see it as a reaction to earlier eras of drawing. It's worth asking whether it was an evolution or a devolution. You just have to go through art history with a sense of curiosity and say, what feeds my intrigue? What do I want to do with my work and with my life, since I have such precious amounts of time to make something meaningful with what I do? So that's kind of interesting, right? We made a tone now, didn't use a stump here at all. Used more of the sharper point. And in this example, we used a stump and we went first layer 2H, second layer 4B, third layer 2H stump. In all this, you get a ton of intrigue. One more thing on this first section of the class, you can get super dark. Right now I'm using an 8B. When you draw and you start really working on tonal quality, you're going to need to deepen the range most of the time. And I want you to just sort of marinate on that with the following, that it isn't necessarily a matter of grabbing an 8B as I have. It could actually be a matter of getting marks positioned that are closer together. So if I go in on top of that 8B with a 4B, it might actually make a better value, not to go heavier with my pressure, but to load up those marks so that I'm not getting much noise, so that I'm actually kind of spreading out the material in such a way, burnishing the material so that I'm covering the tone of the underlying paper fiber. So I always say proximity, not pressure. Closer proximity, in other words. You might find that very beneficial, but you will find that you'll need to go in and specify how deep you can make things, because it'll dramatically impact the amount of range you can use elsewhere in the drawing. This thing about graphite, it's been said quite a bit. There are two things that have been said that stick with me at this moment. One of them was said to me by a student I had for years over at Janus Collaborative and at the League. And she said, I just can't stand drawing in graphite because it's so linear. And I said, well, it really just depends on how you use it. It can be very painterly. And the second thing is graphite getting more silvery as it goes darker. I've loved the Staedtler pencils for a long time. I've got some of these from the earliest manufacturing days. They started making them around 1895, and I've got some of those. They're really beautiful leads. It's got that classic blue look, and then the white label, and then the black tip. And this one is an H. At some point in their history, they introduced this, which is called a Mars Jumbo, and this one is a 4B. And it's essentially just like a nice thick piece of graphite. And it's a beautiful pencil because if you want like a bigger stroke, like with Hatchmark, like we're talking about on Patreon, it'll give you that variety. Like, let's say in the Greuze drawing, in the Met, the River God by Greuze, he's got some beautiful thick marks. So if you've got a Lumograph Jumbo and a regular Lumograph, you'd have a nice variety of things. So I would recommend getting a pack of the Jumbos, and those are easily available. They are the Staedtler Mars Jumbo, and this is called a 4B. And this one, which I have up in my hand here, is by Cretacolor. C-R-E-T-A Color, Cretacolor. I think they're based out of Vienna, Austria. And this is called a monolith, M-O-N-O-L-I-T-H. And I like this one a lot because there's no wood in the pencil. It's all graphite. And so if you're thinking about, again, working the areas and graining technique and that sort of thing, a monolith could be a really good pencil to play around with as an additional piece. This is a curious one. This is a 2B. So it's a fairly hard monolith. Be a good pencil to build up solid flat areas of tonality. And again, I think, because I've seen it work, where a person devotes themselves to developing a quality of tone and their drawing takes off. So you might want to use a monolith or, like I said, a Mars Jumbo. The pencil manufacturers knew about that silvery quality way back in the day, because these examples of material, I want to say amalgamations of a darker, almost inky substance that goes into the graphite, those occur in the 1930s, 1920s even. They knew about it a long time ago. All right, so it doesn't necessarily happen that it gets more silvery. It could actually get deeper and more matte depending upon what you mix it with. I'll give these to you one at a time. The first one is going to be by Kimberly. You know Kimberly, the manufacturers out of New Jersey? Now we're getting into that dark but not shiny thing that we're talking about, the 9XXB. And why is it important? Because you need something like that to anchor your value range. If you don't go dark enough in your value range, it'll be very difficult for you to utilize the delicate values that enable the middle range of the lights, that kind of stuff. So that's a 9XXB by Kimberly. Also available today, Cretacolor, C-R-E-T-A color, out of Vienna again. And this one's called a Nero, N-E-R-O, and it's a medium, and it's very similar to the 9XXB. It's just not quite as dark. It's got something in it which is a little more clay-like. The idea might be that you could take the ebony pencil and you could mix some of this Nero into it. And so it goes darker and it kind of binds into the same mixture. It's very interesting to think about because it's going darker but also filling up that paper. You don't want something that's super crayon-like, like the Kimberly. That's the Kimberly. This is the Nero, and then this is the Nero plus the ebony pencil right there in here. Next one in our experimental range is actually the Lumograph Black. This is contemporary. It's available. You could get it right off the internet now if you want. Lumograph Black is made by Mars, again, made by the same pencil company that has the famous, blue label, black tip. And they make a variety of these. So it feels a little bit like a color pencil. It's not quite as waxy as color pencils are these days. Lots of color pencils feel to me like if you draw a line with color pencil, you have to sharpen it again. That's how much wax they seem to throw into them these days. Almost too much wax. So that's the Mars Lumograph 8B. If you imagine dropping that into a range like this, which was already covered by a 4B and an 8B, which were silvery, you see what that does? It kicks your value down a couple of steps, so you really have a lot of room to model. I guess the colloquial name is Kohitsu, but it's essentially, if you look at Mitsubishi, this is a 6B or a 4B Mitsubishi pencil. Look up Mitsubishi calligraphy pencil. If you have any trouble, just email me. It's a beautiful pencil to draw with, a great pencil. It does go silvery. The purpose of these is, they call it hard brush, which I think is a cool thing, a hard brush pencil, which means that they're learning how to create calligraphy. They're kind of giving these to kids, and kids learn how to use them to make Japanese calligraphy. One more I could show you. It's a Faber-Castell 14B. I feel like I'm listening to Nigel tell me that these go to 11. Anyway, 14B, that's what that is. And that is by Faber-Castell. That's fairly new. It's called a Pit Graphite Matte. And so that's cool, isn't it? It goes dark, but it doesn't go shiny. So if I pick that up, you won't see very much of a reflective quality. In this area, if you can see it, I'm not sure if you can, but that's no matte, and this is the matte stuff. And so you see how it cuts down on the light reflection? So that's kind of helpful. But they're pretty solid in terms of their quality and their universal availability. So that's the first part of the discussion I wanted to have with you tonight. That you should become familiar with the B's and the H's. You should become aware of your preferred texture of paper. You should begin to experiment with your sequencing of your values, your softs and your hards. You should experiment with your points of your pencil and your pressure, and you should be ever mindful of what the paper can take versus what it can't take, in addition to whether you want to utilize a stump and what your anchor actually will be when it comes to expanding the range. All right. I thought the next part of the discussion tonight might entail a practical application of this, and so I wanted to start a drawing for you. What I want you to do is maybe just draw along with me if you don't mind. I think it's kind of fun to draw together because I don't expect you to watch every move, and yet it could be interesting to, have this fresh discussion about something that we love to do that we're sort of looking at in a slightly different way. It's kind of unusual to, draw with certain, specific insights in mind that make and improve your way of working. And one of these insights is going to be legitimately the way that you orchestrate the tonal characteristics. And we know from our discussion and our dialogue that a lot of those tonal characteristics are going to involve nuancing harder and softer leads,